Okay, hello and welcome everyone to this lesson on the Germany 4-mark questions for the AQA course. So if you're studying Germany from 1890 to 1945 as part of your AQA GCSE History course, you're going to find this really, really useful. However, any AQA GCSE History students will also find it useful, even if you're not doing the Germany unit, because there will be an equivalent set of question styles for one of your 4 topics. So this may be useful to you as well. Everyone loves a bit of exam practice, so I've put a nice little yay icon over there. I'm sure we're all very excited for this lesson. So before we start, I would suggest you get this down as a title and then get your 2 key words there: provenance and interpretation. You can pause the video here if you want to copy those down. Now, provenance is really just a fancy word, a formal word for who has written a source and when. Where's the source coming from? Who's the author? When did they write it? An interpretation is literally just a viewpoint. It's an opinion on something. So not a set of facts necessarily, although it can include facts, really an opinion about something historical. Now, you could use the word opinion, or you could just use the word who wrote it. But if you say provenance and interpretation, that is the kind of formal language that examiners like and that will get you a higher grade. So it's much better to use those if you can. So what is our destination for today's lesson? Well, it's nice and simple. The destination question, which we should hopefully be able to answer by the end, is how do I get 4 out of 4 on the Germany 4-mark questions? So there are 2 4-mark questions in the Germany 1890 to 1945 AQA unit. And it is perfectly possible for everyone watching this lesson to get 100% every time on those 2 4-mark questions. Because really, the way that you can approach these, as you'll see, is something like a recipe or robotically. They're the same every time in their format, and the way you should answer them is exactly the same every time. So all it is a matter of practicing them enough that you just know this process inside out. So you just need to collect lots and lots of interpretations once you understand the process that I'm going to explain and practice it. And I promise you, you will be able to get those 4 out of 4 on both those questions. Now, that might not seem like a huge amount of marks in the grand scheme of things, 8, but actually that's very, very significant. That can be 1, even 2 grades difference in your final GCSE. So the 2 4-mark questions, although they're the smallest, are certainly not to be sniffed at. And it's really good to practice this skill now and get it completely automatic so that you're feeling nice and comfortable in the exam. And then you can devote more of your mental energy to those longer questions. Okay, so I thought it might be beneficial just to remind ourselves what the 6 question styles are in the AQA unit. So the ones we're looking at today are the 2 4-markers here. Question 1 will always be, how does interpretation A differ from interpretation B about blank? Now, I've put blank there in block capitals because it could be about anything from within the unit. So it's not always going to be the precise same subtopic. That will vary, but it will always be something from within the Germany 1890 to 1945 unit. And it will show you 2 interpretations, A and B, on the exam paper. Then you've got question 2. Now, question 2 is different. Question 2 is saying, why might the authors of interpretation A and B differ about blank? So again, it's the same 2 interpretations, but this time, instead of just saying how the 2 viewpoints are different, it's saying why the authors of those interpretations would not be likely to have the same view. What is it about who they are, about the provenance, that would make them likely to disagree? That's the question for number 2. A lot of students mix these two questions, together and try and answer in the same way for both of them, but they are different. The key skill of this lesson really is appreciating what the difference is between those 2 question styles. Just to quickly run down the others, although they won't be the focus today. Question 3 is, which interpretation is most convincing? So again, that's working with the same 2 interpretations from question 1 and 2. But this time on question 3, it's saying which one fits our knowledge or fits the facts best, which one is most convincing. Question 4, describe 2 problems affecting blank. So again, that can vary from anything within the unit. Question 5, explain how the lives of blank were affected by blank. Again, so that can be anything from within the unit. And then the bigger one in the Germany unit is this, question 6. Which reason was most important for blank? Blank in that case being a phenomenon that happened in Germany at this time, and it will give you a choice of 2 bullet points. As I say, we're only going to be focusing on 1 and 2 today, the 2 4 markers, but I just thought it would be a good idea to have a look at the full list of Germany questions that you will face in the exam. We'll look at some of these other question styles in future lessons. Okay, so question 1, as we've said, is how does interpretation A differ from interpretation B about blank? Now, I would suggest you use this set of sentence starters, or ones that are very similar and mean the same thing, every single time that you do this question style. It's a way of kind of training your brain so that you will hit each of these 4 marks in turn. Each sentence really is designed to hit one of the individual 4 marks. So let's have a look at them. First sentence, in interpretation A's view of blank, and then you will describe the viewpoint. So interpretation A will say something to you about the topic at hand. You've got to work out what they are saying, what the overall drift of their opinion is, and then state what that is. Nice and simple. Then you say this can be seen from, and you provide evidence from that source that backs up your first sentence. So it should be a quotation if it's a text source, or a detail from an image. What's the actual proof that interpretation is positive, for example, about the topic at hand? Then we do the exact same process, but we come over to interpretation B. So in interpretation B's view, on the other hand, state what that viewpoint is. This can be seen from, and you provide a quote or a textual or a image detail, a piece of evidence from that interpretation that backs up what you're saying. And then finally, this is really just an insurance policy. You'll see that this is actually sentence number 5. So you should already have hit the 4 marks that you need with the first 4 sentences. But it's a good idea, just as an insurance policy, to put in a final sentence to summarize. Interpretation A differs from interpretation B because, and then just re-summarize your case in 1 sentence. So let's look at how this works then, using some examples. So the first one we're going to do is a non-historical example. We're just going to use football. Now, this is a painful one for me, so be sympathetic as we're going through this. Interpretation A is me. I'm Mr. Richardson. So imagine this is something that I have said. Liverpool are the best team in the league and will definitely win the league this year. I absolutely adore them. That's interpretation A. Then Mr. Moore, my colleague, he is the author of interpretation B, and he said this: Liverpool were hilarious tonight. They were useless. They have no chance of winning the league after tonight's performance. I love seeing them fail. So our question then, what we've got to work out is what is the difference between these 2 viewpoints, between these 2 interpretations? What are both of these interpretations actually saying about Liverpool Football Club? So let's start with interpretation A, me. What am I saying about it? Am I being positive or negative about Liverpool as a football club? You may want to just pause the video here, just write down for yourself what you think. Yeah, I'm sure you all got this. So I clearly am being very, very positive about Liverpool as a football club. My viewpoint is positive. So if this were in the exam, I would write interpretation A is positive about Liverpool Football Club. 1 mark out of the 4. Then we need to try and find some evidence from the interpretation that is going to back up what I've just said. So I've just said that interpretation A is positive, but what's my proof? What quotation am I going to use? Again, you may wish to pause the video here and see if you can pick out a quotation that proves that A is positive about Liverpool. So there's loads you could pick. You could easily say Liverpool are the best team in the league as your quote. You could say I absolutely adore them as your quote. You could pick almost anything there as your proof. So my second sentence would be, this can be seen from the quote, Liverpool are the best team in the league. So we've now got 2 out of our 4 marks. We've said what interpretation A is saying overall, and we backed it up with a quote. Now all we need to do is repeat that process for interpretation B. So Mr. Moore, is he being positive about Liverpool or is he being negative? What is his opinion? Pause the video, bullet point down. Absolutely right. Mr. Moore is being negative about Liverpool. He is critical of Liverpool as a football club. So we would write if it was an exam. Interpretation B, on the other hand, is negative about Liverpool. Now we just need to find our quote that backs this up. Again, pause the video. What quotation could we use? Okay, so I think we could use, they have no chance of winning the league. So if we were to write this in an exam, it would be Mr. Moore is being negative, or interpretation B is being negative about Liverpool Football Club. This can be seen from the quotes, they have no chance of winning the league. 4 out of 4 marks on this non-historical example. So now let's try and get into some of the history. Historical example here. We're going to use the Treaty of Versailles. So just to refresh our memories, if we are not sure about this, the Treaty of Versailles was the agreement that Germany was forced to sign after Germany was defeated in the First World War. It contained a lot of clauses, a lot of conditions that the Germans considered to be punishments. So, for example, they had to pay 6.6 billion in reparations money. So that's like compensation money to the countries that had defeated them. They had to reduce their army down to just 100,000 soldiers. They had to give back Alsace-Lorraine to France. They had to accept responsibility, the guilt, the war guilt for starting the First World War. So this was very controversial with the Germans. So let's look at 2 interpretations on the Treaty of Versailles. Number 1, interpretation A. So this is Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, who was Germany's foreign minister and one of their negotiators on the Treaty of Versailles. And on the other side, interpretation B, we've got the French Prime Minister at the time, Georges Clemenceau, both of them writing in 1919. And Clemenceau has got a different view of the treaty. So let's break this down just like we did with the football example. So we're being asked, how does interpretation A differ from interpretation B about the Treaty of Versailles? So where I said blank when I explained this before, we can now fill that in. It's about the Treaty of Versailles. And the question is saying, what is their difference in viewpoints? So we need to start out by thinking, what is interpretation A actually saying? So to do that, we need to read it. Let's read it through together. This fat volume, this is a great quote, this fat volume was quite unnecessary. They could have expressed the whole thing more simply in one sentence. Germany renounces, that means gives up. Germany renounces its existence. So, do you think that von Brockdorff-Rantzau likes the Treaty of Versailles, or is he being more negative about it? Pause the video here, jot down your thoughts or mention them to anyone around you. If you said he's being negative, you are right. This man despises the Treaty of Versailles. But what quotation, what evidence can we use to support that statement? So in the exam, we would write, interpretation A is negative about the Treaty of Versailles, but we now need our quotation. Again, pause the video, see if you can spot a quotation that we could use. So I think a quotation that we could use is von Brockdorff-Rantzau claims that the treaty will force Germany to, quote, renounce its existence. So that would get us our 2 marks. We've said that interpretation A is negative, and we've backed it up with a quotation. Just a reminder of the sentence stems there. We've done exactly what we did with the football example. Describe what the viewpoint is, and then we've given evidence from the source. That's 2 out of 4 so far. So you know what's coming next. We're going to have to do the same process for interpretation B to get our second half of the marks, to get our 3 and 4 out of 4. So let's read through this one. This is Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister. Very different interpretation. He says, there must be justice for the dead and wounded. There must be justice for those millions whose homes and land, ships and property German savagery has ruined and destroyed. Pause the video here. Is Clemenceau saying that the treaty was a good thing or that it was a bad thing, positive or negative? If you said positive, you are correct. George Clemenceau felt the treaty was absolutely fair and that Germany deserved what was coming to it. But what's a quotation that we can use that will back up that opinion that Clemenceau is being positive about the Treaty of Versailles? Again, pause the video here, see if you can find one. I think for this one, you could just go for the first sentence. There must be justice for the dead and wounded. So Clemenceau is saying, look, all of the people that have died at the hands of the German army, those people have to have their justice. Germany has got to suffer for what it's done. It's got to account for the role that it played in the First World War, and therefore the treaty is fair. So if we were using the exam sentence stems, if this was our question, we'd be saying, in interpretation B's view of the Treaty of Versailles, George Clemenceau is claiming that the treaty is a positive thing. This can be seen from the quotation, there must be justice for the dead and wounded. That would get us our 1 and 2 marks for this half. So overall, we've now got 4 out of 4. So you may just want to have a look at the full model answer here. I'll just read this out. In interpretation A's view of the Treaty of Versailles, the viewpoint is negative and suggests it is too harsh against Germany. This can be seen from the quote, Germany renounces its whole existence, suggesting that the treaty humiliated Germany and made them lose their pride. In interpretation B's view, on the other hand, the treaty was a positive thing and suggests that Germany deserved to be punished following the war. This can be seen from the quote, there must be justice for the dead and wounded, which implied that Germany must pay for the damage it has done and the lives it has taken. Remember, we might want to include our summary sentence just to be safe and make sure we've got our 4 marks in the bank. So I've included that here. Interpretation A differs from interpretation B because the viewpoint of A is highly negative, whereas the viewpoint of B takes a positive view of the Treaty of Versailles. Just a summary of my overall argument there in one sentence as a bit of an insurance policy. Okay, so it's going to be time for some independent student practice now. Let's just have a little look at these interpretations. So I'm going to give you 2 interpretations that I would like you to have an independent practice go at while the video is paused. So your interpretation A is from Adolf Hitler, writing in his book, his autobiography, Mein Kampf, in 1925. And again, he's speaking about the Treaty of Versailles. So the topic is exactly the same. This is what Adolf Hitler said. Each point of the treaty could have been engraved on the minds and hearts of the German people and burned into them until 60 million men and women would find their soul aflame with a feeling of rage and shame. That's interpretation A. Interpretation B is from an American historian called Sally Marks, writing a long time after the treaty in 1976. This is what she said. The Treaty of Versailles was severe, but it is amazing that it was not more so. Thanks to Wilson's insistence, Wilson is the president of the USA at this time, was the president of the USA. Thanks to Wilson's insistence, Germany lost remarkably little territory, considering how thoroughly it had lost the war. True, the colonies were gone, but the European losses were relatively few. The real difficulty was not that the treaty was exceptionally severe, but that the Germans thought it was. So, your turn to have a go now. You're going to answer this question. How does interpretation A, Adolf Hitler's view, differ from interpretation B, Sally Marx's view, about the Treaty of Versailles? Just a reminder about the sentence stems. This is how you hit your 4 marks. You're going to say, in interpretation A's view of blank, in this case, the Treaty of Versailles, and then you're going to describe Hitler's viewpoint. Then you're going to say, this can be seen from, and you're going to provide evidence from the source, a quotation from the source that proves what you've just said about that viewpoint. Then you swap over to interpretation B. In interpretation B's view, on the other hand, and you summarize what Sally Marx is saying, what's her viewpoint. Then you're going to say this can be seen from, and again, you're going to give me some evidence, a quotation from this interpretation that proves what you've just said about Sally Marx's viewpoint. And then finally, just our insurance policy, a summary sentence that summarizes everything that you've just said. So pause the video here. You want to take about 5 minutes on this. You don't want to spend any more than 5 minutes in the exam. So try 5 minutes now and see how you get on. Pause the video here, and then I'm going to show you a model answer. and you can compare and see how you got on. Okay, good effort on that, guys. So here we are with a model answer for question 1 about those two interpretations and how they differ on the Treaty of Versailles. In interpretation A's view of the Treaty of Versailles, the viewpoint is highly negative and suggests it has humiliated and enraged the German people. So Hitler is even more negative than Rantzau in the previous set of interpretations. Extremely, extremely negative about the Treaty of Versailles. Now we need to prove it. This can be seen from the quote, 60 million men and women would find their soul aflame with a feeling of rage and shame, which suggests the Germans rightly despised the treaty. So Hitler is basically implying that the entire population of Germany absolutely loathes from the bottom of their hearts this treaty. They see it as a set of punishments. And we've proved that with our quote there. Now we're going to come over to interpretation B. In interpretation B's view, on the other hand, the treaty was less severe than many viewed it as. So Sally Marks, although she's not exactly singing the praises of the Treaty of Versailles, she is certainly not as negative as Hitler. She's taking a more positive view. We now need to prove that. This can be seen from the quote, Germany lost remarkably little territory, which implied that Germany must pay for the damage it has done and the lives it has taken. So Sally Marks is basically saying, look, Germany actually did not lose that much land considering what it had done in the First World War. Ultimately, she is saying Germany had to pay and that really they did not lose that much. They didn't lose much territory. So that is our proof that Sally Marks is being a bit more positive about the treaty. Then we've got our summary sentence, really simple. Interpretation A differs from interpretation B because the viewpoint of A is highly negative, whereas the viewpoint of B takes a more positive view of the Treaty of Versailles. So that is question 1, guys. You've got your first 4 marker now in the bank. We now need to move on to question 2. Question 2 is asking you, why might the authors of interpretations A and B differ about blank? So again, it's going to be the Treaty of Versailles when we get onto the historical examples. But pause here and make sure you've really got this idea that this question is different to question 1. Question 1 is asking you, what is the difference in viewpoints? Question 2 is asking you, what is it about the authors, so the provenance of these interpretations, that would make them likely to take the view that they do? So let's have a look at this and how it would work. The sentence stems go like this. You write interpretation A was written by, and then you state the provenance. Say who wrote this source or who spoke and when. You'll always find this information written either above or below the interpretation in the exam paper. So it'll always be given to you, the provenance. Then you say, this influences their view because. So what is it about either when they were writing or who they were that would influence the viewpoint that they've taken? And then again, you just repeat that process for B. So who was B written by and when, and how would that influence the viewpoint that is in that interpretation? Again, just as an insurance policy, we include our summary sentence. So let's go back to the football example and have a look at it. Why is it? What about the two authors of these interpretations is going to make them differ? So first we need to look at the provenance, which is highlighted there underneath the two interpretations. So looking at interpretation A, who wrote it and when? Well, it's me. Mr. Richardson has written this. I'm a Liverpool fan, and I was speaking on the 5th of February, 2021. Same for interpretation B. Who wrote that? What do we know about them? When did they write it? That's Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore is an Arsenal fan, the provenance tells us, and he was speaking on the 7th of February, 2021, directly after Liverpool lost 4-1 to title rivals Manchester City. I hope everyone feels the pain that I'm going through reading out that sentence. Now we need to figure out what is it about the provenance that affects the likelihood of those two people, me and Mr. Moore, taking those viewpoints. So for example, in interpretation A, why am I likely to be positive about Liverpool? We've already identified that I'm positive about Liverpool, so we don't need to prove that again. We don't want to answer question 1 again. We want to say what it is about me that makes me likely to be positive. So pause the video here and see if you can figure that out. Okay, coming back, there are two things you could say. Number one, it tells you that I'm a Liverpool fan. Obviously, I'm going to be positive about Liverpool if I'm a fan of Liverpool. Nice and easy. You could also mention when I spoke. So on the 5th of February, the game against Man City had not yet been played. And so perhaps my opinion that Liverpool are definitely going to win the league would have seemed more viable, would have seemed more realistic back on the 5th of February. So either of those two things would influence my positive view of Liverpool and the likelihood that they will win the league. Then coming over to Mr. Moore, what is it about Mr. Moore? What do we know about him from the provenance highlighted there that would make him much more negative about Liverpool? So pause the video here and see what you think. Okay, coming back. So there are two things again. Number one, we're informed that Mr. Moore is an Arsenal fan. So, of course, Mr. Moore, as an Arsenal fan, is not likely to be supportive of Liverpool. He's probably going to be much more critical. Secondly, again, we could bring in the time that Mr. Moore spoke. So, on the 7th of February, he was speaking right after Liverpool had lost 4-1 to Man City. And that obviously makes Liverpool a much less likely bet to be able to win the Premier League this season. So both who he is and when he was speaking makes Mr. Moore likely to be more negative about Liverpool. That would get us 4 marks if this was the exam question. So we're going to do the same process then with a historical example. So let's have a look. We're coming back to Rantzau, the German negotiator on the Treaty of Versailles, and Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister. So why might Rantzau take such a negative view of the Treaty of Versailles? What do we know about him from the provenance that would suggest that? A hint for this question is always to think about time, author, and purpose. So we discussed time and author just now in the football example. What about when they were writing and who they are affects the likelihood that they would take the view that they have? And then the last one is purpose. Could they be trying specifically to make something seem a specific way for a particular audience? So purpose can also affect the likelihood that the author would take that viewpoint. So sentence stems here would be interpretation A was written by, and then you state what the provenance is. So that would be Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, Germany's foreign minister. This influences their view because, so what is it about who he is that makes him likely to be negative about the Treaty of Versailles? Well, he's a German. He's the foreign minister for Germany who's actually negotiating on the Treaty of Versailles, and he's speaking in the same year that the treaty was signed, 1919. All of those things mean he's likely to be very emotional and angry about the treaty. He's going to be one of the people that suffers the apparent indignity and humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. And he also might feel, as the negotiator, that some of the responsibility comes his way. So he may feel some bitterness for that and not want to kind of take the responsibility for the treaty. Same process for interpretation B, Clemenceau. What is it that we know about him and when he was speaking, or his purpose, that would make Clemenceau much more positive about the treaty? Pause the video here, see if you can figure it out. So if you said that Clemenceau is much more likely to be positive about the treaty because he was the French Prime Minister, then you're on the right lines. The French, we know, suffered terribly during the First World War at the hands of the Germans. And that makes Clemenceau much more likely to be positive. He's going to feel that Germany deserves the punishments that they're taking as part of the treaty, and that the French deserve their reparations payments to help rebuild and compensate for the damage that they took. So it's obvious that Clemenceau would take a more positive view of the treaty. Let's just have a little check how that looks in a model answer. So interpretation A was written by Brockdorff-Rantzau, the German foreign minister who negotiated for Germany over the treaty. 1 mark. This influences his view because as a German, he would have resented the harsh terms of the treaty, and as their negotiator, he would have felt under pressure to achieve a better result for his country. 2 marks. Interpretation B, on the other hand, was written by Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister in 1919. 3 marks. This influences his view because France were very severely damaged by Germany's army during the First World War, and so Clemenceau wanted revenge against the Germans and reparations money to rebuild. 4 out of 4. but we are going to include our summary sentence just in case. The authors of the two interpretations are very likely to differ because they represent different nationalities with very different experiences of the war. Okay, so it is now time for your independent student practice on this one. We're going back to Adolf Hitler and Sally Marks. So the same set of interpretations that you answered question 1 with, we're now going to try question 2 with. So you've got them up both there, and you've got the sentence stems on the right-hand side. Again, pause the video here, take 5 minutes for yourself, write this out using the sentence stems, and then come back to the video and we'll check the model answer. So if you had something like this, then you're going to get 4 out of 4. Let's take a look. Interpretation A was written by Adolf Hitler, an Austrian-born German citizen who fought in the First World War and had extreme right-wing views. This influences his view because as a German with extreme right-wing views, he would have despised what he saw as the humiliation of the treaty and been trying to stir up anger against it. As a soldier who fought, he may have felt doubly humiliated by the treaty. So we've said who Hitler was and a little bit about him. The fact that he had these extreme right-wing views, very much resented the fact that Germany had surrendered in the first place, let alone being forced to sign this humiliating treaty. And then we've explained how that would have influenced his view. Then same process for B. Interpretation B, on the other hand, was written by Sally Marks, an American historian, and writing many decades later. That would have influenced her view because unlike Adolf Hitler, she did not have the same emotional ties to the event. She was writing long after it occurred and was not personally affected. Therefore, she is less likely to be so strongly negative. So Sally Marks was not German and wasn't there at the time. She's writing a long time afterwards and is from a different nationality. And so she's not got the same emotional sensitivity or negative response to the treaty. She's much more likely to see the positive side of it. And then again, we would put our summary sentence in there, just re-summarizing the argument. So that is the 2 Germany 4 markers, guys. Just a reminder of where we've been in today's lesson. So we've been trying to answer the question, how do I get 4 out of 4 on my Germany 4-mark questions? Hopefully we're now a little bit clearer about that. Just in case, I'm going to put in a little summary again for each one. So question 1 is asking you what's the difference between the 2 interpretations, and then you back it up with a quote. Question 2 is saying what is it about the authors that makes them likely to hold that view, and for that you're going to want to consider time, author, and purpose. Thank you for listening, everyone, and good luck with your course.